The silence that followed was heavy and flat, the kind of stillness that only settles over a valley when a crowd is waiting for an obvious mistake to finish playing out. The light came in slanted and gray, filtering through the bare skeletal oaks of the Shenandoah Valley like cold dishwater. Here, behind the old Augusta County grain shed, the air tasted of damp lime, decayed twine, and the vinegar tang of early November frost. The men gathered around the platform had their opinions ready, as they always did when a neighbor's misfortune was laid bare. Stacked in uneven, sagging towers were 600 sacks of seed nobody in the county wanted. They were water-stained along the bottom, sun-rotted along the top, and the stenciled labels had faded to pale, illegible ghosts. To the modern farmers of the valley, this was not potential. It was a hazardous chore that belonged in a sinkhole. The auctioneer, a thin man named Miller, who had been calling sales in the county for 31 years, stood with his cane braced against the damp wood. He looked at the lot with the profound weariness of a man who just wanted to get home to his stove. "Lot 42, Miller announced, his voice a gravelly rasp. 600 sacks of mixed seed stock from the estate of Edgar Pomeroy. Obsolete varieties, condition poor. Buyer hauls the whole mess. Do I hear $50? Nobody moved. The wind whistled through the gap in the metal roof, rattling the tin. Miller sighed, his shoulders dropping. 25. You couldn't pay me the diesel to load that moldy trash into my flatbed, Garrett Vance said. Garrett was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing a brand-new John Deere cap and insulated work boots. He owned 300 acres of flat machine-tilled bottomland on the South Fork of the river, and he looked at the world as something to be conquered with horsepower and liquid nitrogen. A few of the younger farmers laughed, nodding along in agreement. Miller shook his head. $10. Come on, fellas, let's clear the floor. 15, Hazel Vance said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the low masculine grumbles like a sharp blade. The men turned their boots, crunching on the gravel. A few squinted through the gray light, and then the whispers began. It was her, the Vance girl, the one who had inherited old Hollis Crane's rundown homestead up in the holler 3 months ago after her mother had died in a Charlotte hospital. Hazel stood in a heavy, grease-stained Carhartt jacket that belonged to her late grandfather, 2 sizes too big, the hem hitting her mid-thigh. She was 23, but she carried herself with a heavy, rounded stoop. Her shoulders curved inward, as if she were trying to occupy less space in a world that had repeatedly told her she occupied too much. The long, agonizing months of caregiving had stripped her of her savings, and the grief had left her body soft, heavy, and exhausted. Her dark hair was tied back in a hurried knot. Her cheeks flushed red from both the mountain cold and the sudden weight of a dozen critical eyes. Miller didn't waste time. He brought his wooden gavel down with a sharp crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping underfoot. Sold for $15 to Hazel Vance. Garrett Vance turned his head, a slow, condescending grin spreading across his face. Well, Hazel, he called out loud enough for the loading dock to hear, you just bought yourself 600 sacks of nothing. I hope you've got a big enough shovel to bury it before the county code enforcement comes knocking. Hazel did not answer. She couldn't. She felt the hot sting of blood rushing to her ears, the familiar crushing weight of her own body making her feel clumsy and exposed. But she walked forward anyway, her boots heavy on the frost-hardened dirt. She reached the first stack, pushing past the laughter, and placed her bare palm flat against the coarse, damp burlap. It was cold, yes, but beneath the chill she felt a strange, solid density. A pulse of something dry and patient waiting. You need a hand with those, Miss Vance, Hazel startled, pulling her hand back. Standing beside the loading dock was Jesse Robbie. He was 28 with a lean, weathered face and quiet, dark eyes that had seen things in the deserts of Helmand Province that made the petty gossip of Augusta County seem very small. He had come back from his service 3 years ago with a slight limp, a quiet tongue, and a reputation as the best blacksmith and mechanic in the county. He was wearing an oil-stained canvas coat, his hands dark with coal dust and grease. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were steady and respectful. I've got the flatbed, Jesse said, gesturing with his chin toward a battered '94 Ford F-25, idling near the scales. And my back's still good for something. Hazel looked at him, then back at the towering stacks of burlap. For the first time in months, the knot of panic in her chest loosened just a fraction. I've only got $15 left in my pocket, Jesse, she whispered. Jesse adjusted his cap, his gaze lingering on her face before settling on the grain bags. Didn't ask for your money, Hazel. Your grandfather Hollis let me use his forge when I was 15 and didn't know a weld from a solder. Let's get to loading." As they began to heave the heavy sacks onto the truck bed, Hazel caught Garrett Vance watching them from the warmth of his heated cab. He wasn't laughing anymore, but his eyes were narrow, calculating, and cold. He knew just as Hazel knew that the 18 acres on the ridge still held the only sweet water spring in the valley, and he wanted it. Hazel gripped the rough burlap of the next sack, her muscles straining, her breath rising in white plumes. She didn't know what was inside these 600 rotting bags, but as Jesse took the other end of the sack, his fingers brushing hers, she felt a spark of stubborn defiance ignite in her chest. The winter was coming, the ground was freezing, but the fight for her grandfather's land had just begun. The road up to the old Crane homestead did not climb so much as it fought its way through the mountain, twisting past gray-weathered barns and the skeleton-like remnants of old tobacco allotments that had long since surrendered to the weeds. By the time Jesse's battered truck groaned up the final rutted gravel drive, the sun was a cold, yellow sliver slipping behind the western ridge of the Thung-Lung Shenandoah. The tin roof of the two-story farmhouse rattled in the rising wind, and the front porch egalit on its left side like a tired shoulder. To anyone else, it was a ruin. To Hazel, it was the only place left on earth that did not demand she explain her grief or her heavy, quiet existence. "We'll put them in the dry bay of the barn," Aunt Clara said, stepping out onto the porch before the truck had even fully shuddered to a halt. At 79, Clara Vance was a wire-tight force of nature who wore her late husband's flannel shirts, faded denim overalls, and muddy rubber boots without an ounce of self-consciousness. She didn't ask why Hazel had spent her last $15 on moldering seed sacks. She simply grabbed the corner of the first 60-pound bag Jesse hoisted off the flatbed and heaved it with a sharp, practiced grunt that put men half her age to shame. For 3 brutal, freezing days, the barn became their entire world. Hazel, Jesse, and Toby, the quiet 17-year-old neighbor boy who lived on Clara's biscuits, and Silence worked in the mornings before the mountain air turned to ice, and in the afternoons until the gray winter light bled entirely from the sky. For Hazel, every single lift was a reckoning. Her lungs burned in the freezing air, her thighs trembled under the heavy loads, and her soft hands unused to anything heavier than an office keyboard, and Charlotte blistered and bled. Her body, which she had hated for so long for its soft, heavy defensiveness, began to ache with a new, purposeful pain. It was a clean ache, one that did not feel like weakness. By the third evening, the dry bay of the barn was stacked high, smelling deeply of cedar coarse burlap and the sweet, musty slumber of old grain. Toby had slipped away in the dark, leaving Hazel and Jesse alone in the dim amber glow of a single hanging light bulb. Jesse stayed late to help patch a gap in the barn roof where the winter ice might leak through his hands, moving with the quiet, effortless precision of a man who worked with coal and steel. "Your grandfather Hollis was a particular man," Jesse said, wiping a streak of black grease from his brow with the back of his hand as he stood beside the towering stacks. He pointed down toward a sack near the center of the pile that had a faint penciled letter W on the seam, nearly rubbed to nothing by the decades. Hazel knelt her knees, groaning with the deep fatigue of the day's labor. She untied the rough twine and reached her hand deep into the dark of the sack. When she pulled her fingers out, her palm was filled with small, pale gold kernels that had a silvery, translucent sheen. "Widow's hair," Aunt Clara whispered, stepping into the barn with a kerosene lantern that cast long dancing shadows against the wooden walls. Her old eyes went wide, reflecting the golden light of the kernels. "My mother grew this during the worst of the Great Depression. I haven't seen a seed of it in 30 years. I thought it was gone forever." Jesse knelt down beside Hazel, his shoulder brushing against hers in the cold. The proximity made Hazel's breath catch, but she did not pull away. Jesse reached out his thumb, gently brushing over the golden kernels resting in her open palm. His skin was rough, calloused from his forge, but his touch was incredibly light, almost reverent. "My grandfather told me about this stuff," Jesse said softly, his dark eyes fixed on the grain before drifting up to meet hers. "He said it had roots that could find water in dry rock when everything else was burning up. He said it was the only thing that kept this valley alive after the big freeze of '57. Hazel looked from the seed to Jesse's face. In the warm, flickering lantern light, the guarded quietness of his expression softened. He did not look at her with the pity she had grown used to in Charlotte, nor with the condescension of the men at the loading dock. He looked at her as if she were a vital part of the mountain itself. Later that night, after Jesse had driven his rumbling truck down the mountain, Hazel sat at the kitchen table by the light of a kerosene lamp. The house was quiet save for the wind whistling through the tin roof. She opened the dusty tin box her grandfather had left her on the top shelf of the closet behind the old quilts. Inside lay his leather-bound notebook, its corners sawn smooth by his thumb. She turned to the first page, her fingers tracing his tight-penciled script that had gone silver in the light. "The old corn remembers this ground, Hazel. The new hybrids they sell in town want to be fed from a bag and watered from a pipe. They have no memory. The old kind knows how to struggle. Do not let Garrett Vance or any of his kin sell the hill. The dirt knows who we are." A cold shiver ran down Hazel's spine, but it was followed immediately by a deep, settling warmth. Underneath her grandfather's entry, she picked up a pencil and wrote in her own small, careful hand, November 12th. "The seed is safe in the barn. We begin in the spring." She closed the notebook, but before she could blow out the lamp, a sudden heavy knock rattled the back door. Hazel froze. She stood up, her newly strengthened muscles tensing, and walked to the window. Outside, idling in the dark driveway with its headlights glaring into the dry weeds, was Garrett Vance's big, black dual-cab truck. He had not come to congratulate her. He had come to claim what he believed she was too weak to keep. Garrett Vance did not step out of his truck into the cold November wind, nor did he knock again. He simply let the heavy engine rumble in the driveway for 3 long, intimidating minutes, his headlights cutting through the kitchen window like twin yellow daggers, before he backed out his tires, spitting gravel as he vanished down the mountain. The silent threat hung in the freezing air long after the taillights faded, a stark reminder that winter was not the only force waiting to freeze Hazel out. But when the spring finally broke over the Shenandoah Valley in April, it did not find the same girl who had cowered behind the curtains. The snow retreated to the highest peaks of the Blue Ridge, leaving the earth damp, sweet-smelling, and heavy with the scent of pine and thawed clay. Hazel's transformation had begun in the dark, wood-heated winter, but it became undeniable under the greening sun. The sluggish, heavy defensiveness that had dogged her since her mother's death was gone, burned away by months of hauling split oak, turning compost, and walking the steep slopes of her grandfather's hill. She had lost the soft weight of her grief. In its place was a lean, solid strength. Her shoulders were broad and straight, her jawline defined, and her eyes held the bright, calm clarity of a woman who knew exactly what her body could endure. She still wore her grandfather's faded flannel shirts, but they no longer looked like a disguise. They looked like armor. "The ground is too steep for Garrett's big John Deere anyway," Jesse said one crisp morning, leading a shaggy gray mule named Pete up the winding driveway. Jesse had spent the winter in his dark forge, his hammer ringing against the anvil, as he repaired an old 1930s walking plow he'd found rusting in Clara's back pasture. "You think we can do 4 acres with a single mule and a piece of scrap iron?" Hazel asked, leaning on her hoe and wiping the sweat from her brow. "We can if we go slow," Jesse said, a rare, genuine smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He had spent almost every weekend at the farm, helping her clear the briars and repair the perimeter fencing. The silence between them had grown comfortable, filled with the shared language of hard work and small, unspoken gestures, a thermos of hot coffee shared on a cold stump. A hand extended to help her over a fallen log, his thumb lingering just a second too long against her palm before she climbed down from the flatbed. For 12 grueling days, they broke the stubborn ground. Jesse held the plow handles, his boots sinking deep into the dark, rocky clay, his muscles straining against the pull of the mule, while Hazel walked ahead, leading Pete by the halter. It was brutal, bone-wearying work. The rocks of the Shenandoah did not yield easily. The mountains seemed to fight back, throwing up hidden limestone shelves that threatened to shatter the iron share. But as the furrows opened, the smell of fresh, undisturbed earth filled the valley, rich, dark, and full of ancient secrets. They planted by hand exactly as Hollis Crane had done. Hazel walked the rows with a heavy wooden stick she had carved to a 3-inch notch. She pressed the stick into the dark soil, dropped 2 pale gold kernels of widow's hair into the earth, and Jesse followed behind, using the heavy heel of his boot to firm the soil over the seed. By May, the news of the Vance Girls Circus had traveled through the county. Men at the Augusta Feed and Seed laughed over their morning coffee, their boots propped up on the porch rail. "Planting with a stick like it's 1880, Garrett Vance sneered, leaning against the counter as Jesse walked in to buy plow bolts. "She's going to grow nothing but pigweed and disappointment. That hill is dead, and she's too stubborn to see she's bearing her grandfather's name with it." Jesse didn't lower his head. He walked straight up to Garrett, his lean frame rigid, his dark eyes cold as anvil iron. Hollis Crane planted that hill with a stick for 50 years, Garrett, and he never had to lease his soul to the bank to pay for his fertilizer. You worry about your own corn. We'll worry about ours. By June, the field was a silent miracle of green. The widow's hair came up first, slim and pale, but standing remarkably straight against the harsh mountain winds. The preacher's knee followed its stalks, developing that characteristic sturdy bend at the 2-foot mark, just as Hollis's notebook had promised. One evening after the sun had dipped below the ridge and the valley was bathed in a soft twilight blue, Hazel stood at the top of the slope looking down at the green ribbing of her field. Jesse walked up behind her, his footsteps quiet on the clover. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his shoulder, the scent of coal smoke and sweetgrass lingering on his clothes. "You did it, Hazel," he said softly. Hazel looked down at her hands, rough-tanned and strong. "We did it, Jesse." He turned to her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I've seen a lot of beautiful places, Hazel," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had kept locked away since the war. "But I've never seen anything as beautiful as you standing on this hill." Hazel didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air. When he kissed her, it tasted of salt dust and the deep, sweet promise of the earth beneath their feet. But as they stood together in the fading light, Hazel looked down toward the valley floor. There, the massive center pivot irrigators on Garrett Vance's land were already turning hiss-spraying millions of gallons of water over his vast fields. The air was dry, too dry for June, and the sky to the west was a hard, brassy yellow. A silent, hot wind was beginning to blow, carrying the first whispers of a devastating heat waves. The brassy sky of June hardened into an iron vault by July, bringing a drought that settled over the Shenandoah Valley like a suffocating blanket. For 45 days, the sun beat down without mercy, a blinding white-hot disk that sucked every drop of moisture from the earth. Down in the flat bottomlands, Garrett Vance's state-of-the-art hybrid corn, highly engineered for maximum yield but utterly dependent on a constant diet of chemical fertilizer and artificial watering, began to fail. The massive diesel pumps groaned day and night, sucking the riverbed down to a muddy trickle, but it was not enough. By mid-morning, Garrett's corn leaves curled into tight gray-green needles, and the stalks tasseled short, dry, and barren. The clay between his rows cracked open in deep, jagged fissures, like broken bone. But up on Hazel's Hill, the widow's hair did not buckle. Its leaves remained wide, dark, and coated in a thick, protective wax that locked the moisture inside. Its roots, shaped by a century of surviving the unpredictable Appalachian climate, pushed deep through the rocky limestone, finding the cool subterranean aquifers that lay 5 feet beneath the surface. Where the modern hybrids withered, the old corn thrived, standing tall and vibrant against the yellow, dead hillsides. Slowly, the laughter in the valley died down, replaced by a quiet, stunned disbelief. Neighbors began driving past the old Crane place, their trucks idling on the gravel road below the ridge. They stared up at the 4 acres of lush, waving green corn that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Old Eliam Robbie was the first to make the climb. He walked up the porch steps on a stifling August evening, his sweat-stained hat held reverently in both hands, and looked at Hazel as if she had performed a miracle. "Hollis's corn," Eliam said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I haven't seen a stand of widow's hair look like that since the dry summer of '57. Hazel, you've got a real crop when the rest of us have nothing but kindling." "It's not me, Mr. Robbie," Hazel said softly, standing beside Jesse on the porch, their fingers tightly intertwined. "It's the dirt. It remembered how to feed them." When the harvest came in October, the valley did not watch from afar. They came to help. Men who had once sneered at Hazel's wooden planting stick arrived with empty burlap sacks and calloused hands ready to work. They harvested the old-fashioned way, walking the rows and snapping the heavy gold and silver ears from the stalks, tossing them into the bed of Jesse's truck. The yield was not a record-breaking mountain of grain, but it was honest, heavy, and completely free of debt. Hazel saved the seed first, just as her grandfather had taught her. Under Clara's sharp, watchful eye, she packed the largest, most perfect ears into the old lard tins, sealing the edges with melted beeswax, and carried them to the high, dry rafters of the smokehouse. "For next year," she whispered, patting the cold metal. In late October, Jesse brought home a surprise. In the back of his flatbed sat a restored 1948 tabletop stone burr mill he'd salvaged from an estate sale and spent weeks rebuilding in his forge. Together, they set it up on the sturdy wooden kitchen table by the window. On the 2nd of November, exactly 1 year to the day since Hazel had stood in the mud at the county auction, trembling in her grandfather's oversized jacket, she poured the first batch of widow's hair kernels into the iron hopper. Jesse stood close behind her, his strong arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder as she took hold of the heavy crank and turned. The stones groaned a low, rhythmic purr that vibrated through the floorboards, and then the flour began to fall. It was pale gold, warm to the touch, and smelled intensely of dry earth, clean wind, and the sweet, rich fat of the land. Aunt Clara baked the very first skillet of cornbread in Hollis's old, seasoned cast-iron pan. They ate it hot, with nothing but fresh butter sitting around the kitchen table, while the first cold wind of winter rattled the tin roof. Clara took a bite, chewed slowly, and closed her eyes. A single silent tear slipped down her deeply lined cheek. "That's the bread," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the exact taste of my mother's kitchen. I thought I'd go to my grave without ever tasting it again." By mid-November, the word had spread through the county like wildfire. Hazel didn't need a website or advertisements. The old party lines and the post office bench did the work for her. She sold her stone-ground meal in hand-stamped paper bags for $6 apiece, the same price for everyone from the poorest family in the mountain hollers to the retired folks in town. On the final Saturday before Thanksgiving, a massive black dual cab truck pulled up the gravel drive. Garrett Vance got out. He no longer looked like the proud, imposing man who had mocked her on the loading dock. His eyes were bloodshot. His shoulders had the defeated sag of a man who had just spent his life savings on chemicals that couldn't buy rain, and his brand-new cap looked dusty and worn. He walked slowly into the barn where Hazel and Jesse were packing the last of the autumn grind. "Hazel," Garrett said, clearing his throat and refusing to meet Jesse's steady, protective gaze. "I'd like to buy 2 bags of the widow's hair meal. My wife, she says she remembers her grandmother baking with it, and she won't have anything else for Thanksgiving." Hazel looked at Jesse, who gave her a quiet, supportive nod. Then she looked back at her cousin. "I'm sold out through April, Garrett," Hazel said, her voice calm, steady, and entirely free of malice. "The local families spoke for the whole grind weeks ago." Garrett shifted his weight from one boot to the other, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'll pay $20 a bag, Hazel," he muttered, reaching into his pocket for his leather wallet. "Triple the price." Hazel placed her hand gently on the very last remaining paper bag on the wooden table. She looked at him, not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who finally knew her own worth and knew that some things could never be bought. "The price is $6, Garrett," she said softly. "Same as it is for everyone. I can't take another person's bread just because you have more paper in your pocket, but I'll put your name down first on the list for the May grinding." Garrett stood silent for a long moment, the wind whistling through the barn wood. Finally, he let out a slow, heavy breath and nodded, looking at her with a newfound respect. "Put me down for May, Hazel, 2 bags. "I'll do that," she smiled. As Garrett's truck rolled slowly back down the drive, Hazel stepped out onto the porch. The evening sun was setting over the Shenandoah painting, the ridges and deep bruises of purple and gold. Jesse stepped up behind her, drawing his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Hazel leaned into him, her hand resting over his. Below them, the 4 acres of corn stubble lay quiet under the first winter frost, but she knew what lay beneath. The seeds were safe, the soil was resting, and she was finally beautifully exactly where she belonged.